Some of Australia's leading aquaculture experts are helping fast-track the fledgling oyster industry in Vietnam. While fish farming has grown rapidly there in the last decade, until recently, oysters had been largely overlooked. But that's all changed in the north of the country, where the shellfish is giving struggling farmers a more secure future. Kerry Staight recently travelled to Vietnam for a series of stories on Australian agricultural aid projects, starting in one of the most stunning World Heritage sites, Ha Long Bay.
As the sun rises over Vietnam's northeast coast, it's easy to see why tourists are drawn to this region. But for the locals, the million-dollar views and imposing limestone islands, which stretch more than 100 kilometres, scarcely warrant a second glance. For them, it's the catch that counts. And around here, that catch is increasingly harvested from sea farms rather than the wild.
Most people living in Ha Long Bay, in Cát Islands, in the past time, they are, we call boat families. They have small boats. They have to struggling for living costs. But now someone moving into fish counter, someone moving into oyster counter, some people moving into other mollusk counter. So they earn from this.
Thousands of floating farms bob alongside mighty monoliths in and around Ha Long Bay. And beneath the rafts is something of a seafood basket. With cobia, red drum, groper, barramundi and clams among the most popular species being cultured. Now, a growing number of farmers are also pulling up Pacific oysters.
It's been absolutely phenomenal. Within the space of 3 years, they've virtually gone from zero oyster production in the north through to about 2,000 tonnes now. And to put that in perspective, that's about 50% of New South Wales' current production.
Much of that production has come from this farm in Long Bay, which is northeast of the better-known Ha Long Bay. It's owned by BIM, a private investment company and the largest shrimp producer in Vietnam. A few years ago, it diversified into oysters.
The first 2 years, it was very slow, and we only sold a small amount. But we picked up quite quickly from 2008. In 1 year, production increased 4 times, and at the end of 2009, other farmers started growing around here.
Most farmers here grow their oysters on colch, recycled shells that are tied to a line and slung beneath rafts. Locals say the filter feeders thrive in these warm, nutrient-rich waters, growing from a spat to a commercially acceptable mollusk in less than 12 months. But despite the formidable natural barriers around many of the bays, the farms are still vulnerable to the elements, especially during the monsoon season.
Even though the mountains and the islands protect our farm by reducing the strength of the storms, the bad weather often causes some damage.
Wild weather isn't the only challenge. One of the most pressing issues facing farmers is getting enough spat to grow in the first place. And that's where the Australian connection comes in. On Cat Ba Island, not far from Ha Long Bay, is one of Vietnam's most advanced oyster hatcheries. In the space of 3 years, annual production has increased from 10 million to 100 million juveniles, under the guidance of some of Australia's leading oyster researchers, like Dr. Wayne O'Connor from New South Wales.
In comparison to hatcheries in Australia, they still have a little way to go, but they've come a long way since we first went and had a look at the facilities. They've developed some high-quality algal facilities now, so they're producing more species, better algal species to feed to their bivalves. Their technology is coming along in leaps and bounds, and it won't be long before they're producing at the same sorts of rates that we are.
So this is a very advanced facility. The Vietnamese are certainly aquaculture enthusiasts. The head of this government-owned hatchery, Dr. Liu, has been involved in the industry for 35 years. In that time, farmed production has grown from around 80,000 to 2.5 million tonnes, overtaking the catch from wild fisheries.
Within only 10 years, our aquaculture production tripled.
He says the rapid growth of the oyster industry is largely due to the bilateral project, which is funded by the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research.
When they coming to teach from the beginning with live feed, select a good quality broodstock, spawn them, nurse them from early stage up to Spat. Within only 2 years, we already enabled to brood seed. If we do ourselves, maybe take 4 years, 5 years, we don't know how long.
While this project has gone from strength to strength in the hatchery and out in the field, a similar one in 2002, funded by the Vietnamese government, failed. The broodstock, which came from Australia, produced plenty of offspring. They just didn't last long. Experts aren't sure what went wrong.
They produced significant numbers of seed. They went out into the field and then there were massive losses. And part of the problem was that the grow out of the oyster simply wasn't monitored, so when the losses occurred, we didn't have an opportunity to go back and say what's actually happened here.
That's something which has been rectified for round 2. Samples are regularly taken to look for signs of poor growth or disease. And this time the spat appear to be thriving in a farm environment, giving researchers the confidence to commercialise the project on a much bigger scale.
Initially when we started, we focused on one larger farm in order to get the technology out and so that people could see it operating. All the small farmers would have an opportunity to see what they're doing and then an opportunity to start to take it up. Now more and more small farmers are coming on board. We've got about 200.
Among them is Fatih Liu. She used to work in forestry planting eucalypts, but a few years ago the grandmother of one and her husband changed course, believing they could make better money offshore. She started growing tuhai, or otter clams, a specialty of the area, but then branched out into oysters.
The first year is difficult and usually a failure, but after that, when you have experience, it can be very simple.
The hardest part, she says, is maintaining the stock, keeping the molluscs clean so they aren't attacked by parasites. On the plus side, she's now earning a much better income from the oysters, which don't need feeding and have a farm gate price in Vietnam of around $1.40 a kilo.
We have been able to afford a new house which we built 2 years ago. Now we're using our profits to expand our farm. If I have any extra money, I will save it for my children and my grandchildren.
Another oyster grower who is expanding is Phat Van Lu. The former fish trader turned to culturing seafood because of the decline in wild stocks. After a successful trial run with the shellfish, he's now planning to make his farm 10 times bigger.
I bought seeds from Ria number 1, the hatchery in Cat Bar. But because the hatchery doesn't have enough seeds to cater for this region, half of my seeds are from there and half are from another hatchery. The seeds from the centre at Cat Bar are half the price and better quality.
It's tremendously exciting. Certainly the pace of growth has been fantastic. And so people are seeing the opportunity. They're very willing adopters. They've had experience with growing some other molluscs before. They've had scallops and mussels and so on. So they see this as an extension of what they're already doing. And provided the hatcheries can keep up the spat supplies, then these small farmers are more than willing to get involved.
Some, though, are worried there isn't the market to keep up with the pace of production.
In the last 2 years, we haven't produced enough oysters to meet the market. But in 8 to 10 months, we'll have a lot more. The industry's growing very fast. It's maybe 100 times bigger than it was. And I'm worried because I don't know where we can sell everything we produce.
Most oysters grown in these parts are eaten in the north of the country, usually in local restaurants or in Hanoi. While there have been oversupply problems in some other aquaculture industries in Vietnam, Wayne O'Connor says there's no risk of saturating markets with oysters anytime soon.
Well, oysters are interesting at the moment, particularly Pacific oysters, because most of what is being produced is actually being consumed domestically. There is some movement around the world, but the bulk's domestic consumption. Within Vietnam, you've got a largely untapped market for oysters, so I still think there's a lot of opportunity for oysters to actually produce and consumed locally. But certainly to the north in China, where growth is occurring at such a rapid rate, there are a lot of calls at the moment for more oyster production, despite the fact that China already produces in excess of 80% of the world's oysters. There's more and more demand, particularly for high-quality product.
While it's clear this region is more than capable of producing commercial quantities of oysters, it'll have to improve the quality if it's going to crack the export market. And that means changing the way many farmers grow their molluscs. Because while this method may be cheap, the shellfish often end up different shapes and sizes. In Australia, instead of growing them in clumps, juveniles are placed apart from each other in trays or baskets so they can develop in a more uniform way. Some Vietnamese farmers are starting to adopt similar techniques.
I remember people putting fish and seafood in baskets, so I did a trial with oysters. I bought 1,000 baskets and I put small oysters in them and they grew very well. So I bought a lot more, and now I have about 18,000 baskets on my farm.
But investing in more expensive infrastructure right now isn't realistic for many seafood growers, who earn an estimated average income of between $1,800 and $3,000 a year.